Most Americans picture Hawaii and they see a postcard, a honeymoon destination, an escape from winter, May tastes on the beach. They see paradise. But what they don't see, tucked just behind the resorts in Lewis, are the radar arrays, the nuclear submarine pens, and the command headquarters for the entire Pacific. I'll never forget the morning in January 2018. I was a senior in high school, just going through the motions of another ordinary day. Then my phone lit up with a message that sent a jolt through the entire state. In stark capital letters, it read, "Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill." For 38 agonizing minutes, that was our reality. People were running for cover, calling loved ones to say their last goodbyes. The panic was real. It was absolute. Then, second alert, false alarm. But while the threat wasn't real, the fear was. And that fear revealed a fundamental truth for the rest of the country. Global conflict is foreign policy, something you watch on the news. But here, we live inside that policy. That false alarm was a brutal reminder that beneath the postcard, Hawaii isn't just a state. It's a fortress, a shield, and a target. Okay, let's unpack this. That feeling of absolute terror during the 2018 missile false alarm, the jolt it sent through the state, it really revealed a fundamental truth about Hawaii's place in the world, didn't it?
It absolutely did. That moment stripped away the veneer.
And what we've looked at shows us exactly what that truth is. That Hawaii is fundamentally a fortress, a shield, and a vital strategic hub.
That's a crucial distinction, really.
Yeah.
And it sets the stage perfectly for our deep dive today. If you, the listener, want to truly understand modern Hawaii, you have to look past that, that picture-perfect image. You need to acknowledge that it is, first and foremost, a massive military staging ground.
Right. So what's our mission here? What are we breaking down?
Well, our mission is to really analyze the three interconnected dynamics that fundamentally define this reality. First, we'll explore the island's indispensable role as the primary U.S. military anchor in the Pacific. You can't overstate its importance.
Okay, the strategic anchor. Got it.
Then we'll examine the profound historical injustice related to land ownership, which is, the very foundation of that military presence. It didn't just appear out of nowhere.
The history of the land itself. Crucial.
Exactly. And finally, we'll analyze the complex socioeconomic and cultural reality of being this massive, indispensable staging ground. We have to look at the daily cost that entails for the people who actually call Hawaii home.
So strategy, history, and the human cost today. Let's dive in. Let's start with that first piece then, the sheer undeniable reality of its geopolitical position. When you look at the strategy documents, the core viewpoint seems crystal clear. Any significant conflict or tension in the East, it's going to unfold in the Pacific.
That's the assessment, yes. The Pacific is the arena.
And Hawaii is positioned as the non-negotiable key to that entire ocean. I've seen it called the world's largest aircraft carrier.
That's a common phrase, and for good reason. It captures that sense of a fixed forward platform. But what's really fascinating here is not just the location itself, but the incredible concentration of command power centered right there on Oahu.
You mean INDOPACOM?
Yeah. Exactly. Camp H.M. Smith on Oahu is the command headquarters for U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, INDOPACOM. And you have to grasp the scale here. This is the largest and oldest U.S. combatant command in the world.
Largest and oldest.
It's responsible for joint military operations spanning over 100 million square miles.
100 million square miles. That's hard to even visualize. It's over half the Earth's surface.
Over half the Earth's surface, yeah. We're talking about an area that encompasses 73 countries and holds something like 60% of the world's population.
The scale is just staggering. So what makes putting that HQ in Hawaii so uniquely valuable? Why not just run it from, say, California?
It really boils down to irreplaceable forward positioning. In any scenario involving deterrence or needing a rapid response, time is absolutely the critical variable.
Right, speed matters.
Hawaii puts that vital command center roughly 2,500 miles closer to Asia than any base you could have on the West Coast. That's days saved in transit time for leadership or critical assets.
Okay, that makes sense. And this is crucial for the current mission focus.
Absolutely essential, especially when you consider the current U.S. strategic outlook. The 2022 National Defense Strategy explicitly identifies the main challenge to national security as attempts by, rivals to refashion the Indo-Pacific region.
To countering influence, essentially.
It's about maintaining stability and influence, yes.
Yeah.
So Hawaii's presence is deemed essential for strategic deterrence, showing capability, ensuring a quick response if needed, and also for running these massive joint training exercises.
Like with Japan, Australia, the Philippines.
Precisely. With key allies. If you are coordinating any major projection of force into the Pacific or even just joint patrols, you are fundamentally relying on this command structure based in Hawaii.
So it truly is the nerve center. And to get a sense of that total control, we need to look at the command structure under INDOPACOM, right? It's not just one office.
Oh, absolutely not. It's coordinating 5 distinct subordinate service component commands, all headquartered right there in the region, reporting up to Camp H.M. Smith.
5 commands. That's huge.
Exactly. We're talking about a completely integrated total domain operation. Think about it. The HQ at Camp H.M. Smith coordinates U.S. Army Pacific. That's a USARPAC.
Okay, the Army side.
Then there's the Pacific Fleet, PAT CFLT, handling all the naval and submarine operations across that vast ocean.
The Navy, got it.
Then you have Pacific Air Forces, PASAF, managing the air assets, the long-range bombers, the fighters, everything that flies.
Air Force, check.
Marine Forces Pacific, MARFRPAC, for the Marine Corps component.
Marines, makes sense.
And now, even the recently established Space Forces, Indo-Pacific U.S. Space for INDOPACOM.
Wait, Space Force too? So this one command center on Oahu is managing everything from subs deep underwater to satellites in orbit.
That's right. Deep sea to outer space, all coordinated from that single geographic point.
That concentration of power, I mean, it seems like a logistical miracle, it really does. But doesn't it also sound like an overwhelming operational risk, having everything centered in one place?
It's definitely both. It's an absolutely essential node for projecting power, which makes it logistically superb, yes. But as your own experience in that opening story demonstrated so clearly, it also makes it an incredibly high-value target.
Right, the flip side of the coin.
This centralization turns Hawaii into the strategic brain of U.S. operations across the entire Pacific. It allows for that instantaneous coordination you need for modern joint warfare. Think about PACFLT managing those nuclear-powered submarines out there on silent patrols, or PASAF coordinating long-range bomber missions across continents.
All run from Oahu?
All coordinated from Oahu, yeah.
Okay, this centralization then leads us directly to the logistical and operational edge the islands provide. You called it an indispensable staging ground.
That's exactly what it is. Pearl Harbor Hickam, the joint base there, is the critical hub. That's where you see the constant movement of massive amounts of personnel, equipment, ships, planes.
That's the main transit point.
It's the primary coordination center for those huge international exercises you mentioned earlier. REMPAC is the big one everyone knows.
RIMPAC, right. The Rim of the Pacific exercise. That's the massive naval war game, basically.
It is. It's where you see dozens of allied navies actually practicing how to coordinate and fight together, side by side. It's essentially a live simulation of the kind of joint multinational operation that would be absolutely necessary in any serious conflict scenario.
And they're training the world's navies right there on Hawaii's doorstep.
Precisely. It underscores the centrality of the location. And beyond just projecting power outwards, Hawaii also serves as the absolute front line for missile defense.
This ties directly back to that terrifying morning in 2018 you described.
Exactly. There are missile defense systems located across the islands. The most notable is probably the Pacific Missile Range Facility, PMRF, over on Kauai.
PMRF on Kauai. What makes it so important?
Well, PMRF is one of the world's largest instrumented testing and training ranges. It provides that immediate frontline detection and defense capability for missile threats coming from across the Pacific. It's literally where the U.S. military practices shooting down incoming missiles. It's a globally unique test bed,
Yeah.
but also highly exposed.
Yeah, highly exposed. That really hits home. And this is where we have to connect that huge strategic overview back to the human reality, doesn't it? Tying it back to the opening. For the planners sitting in the Pentagon, this is all strategic deterrence, rational calculations.
Abstract concepts on a map.
But the people of Hawaii, they live inside that policy, and that policy inherently makes them a target.
We heard that story, didn't we? About Chemo, who was there during the 2018 false alarm.
Yeah.
That moment, just standing on his lanai, when that terrifying message hit his phone, it just crystallized that inherent vulnerability for him. He describes suddenly realizing in a visceral way that his home, the place he loved, was specifically identified by potential adversaries as a primary military target.
It's a chilling story because it highlights that psychological burden, the constant underlying stress. For those 38 agonizing minutes, Chemo and thousands, hundreds of thousands of others were scrambling, trying to find shelter, knowing deep down that if the alert had been real,
there'd be virtually no effective defense. Maybe minutes of warning, at best.
Right. And the false alarm message afterwards, it didn't erase that feeling of utter powerlessness, did it? If anything, it confirmed the unique exposure.
Exactly. That experience perfectly illustrates what we mean by the gut-wrenching human experience of living right in the crosshairs of global tensions. Deterrence is an abstract policy term for Washington, but for residents, it's the visceral reality of constantly being on high alert, whether they consciously think about it daily or not.
They bear the psychological cost of being that fortress, always aware, somewhere in the back of their minds, that their security is inherently tied to being the first and most exposed line of defense in the Pacific.
It's a heavy weight to carry, alongside the Métis and the beaches.
Okay, so we've established why the U.S. believes it needs this fortress today, this anchor in the Pacific. But now we have to pivot and ask that really difficult fundamental question. How did the U.S. actually get the land? How did it legally and politically acquire the physical ground needed for this immense military presence?
That's the critical question, isn't it? Because that strategic importance we just discussed is built on a very deep and frankly painful history of occupation and displacement.
It didn't happen in a vacuum.
Not at all. The foundation of this massive military footprint traces all the way back to the 19th century. Initially, the interest was more about commerce. Global trade routes were expanding, and the U.S. Navy, along with commercial shipping, needed a reliable coaling station in the mid-Pacific. That was the driver back in the 1860s.
Just a refueling spot.
That was the initial idea. But those purely military and commercial interests very quickly merged with the, aggressive commercial ambitions of American sugar planters and businessmen who were already operating and gaining influence within the Hawaiian Kingdom.
So the business interests got involved.
Deeply involved. And that blending of commercial power and nascent military objectives laid the groundwork for the eventual political upheaval.
Which culminated in the 1893 overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom.
That's right. A bloodless coup, technically, staged by a small group of American and European businessmen. They formed something called the Committee of Safety.
And they moved against the recognized monarch, Queen Liliuokalani.
They did. But crucially, and this is key, this was not just some purely civilian uprising or internal affair.
The U.S. military was involved?
Explicitly backed by the U.S. military. Marines from the warship USS Boston, which was conveniently anchored in Honolulu Harbor, landed on shore. The official pretext was, protecting American lives and property amidst the turmoil.
The standard justification.
Right. But their very presence on the streets lent undeniable military weight and, frankly, intimidation, supporting the coup plotters. Queen Liliuokalani recognized this immediately. She yielded her authority, but under profound protest. She specifically appealed to the U.S. government in Washington, calling on them to investigate the illegal action of their representatives and restore the Hawaiian monarchy.
She emphasized she was yielding not to the businessmen, but to the superior force of the United States itself.
Precisely. She put the responsibility squarely on the U.S. government.
And there was an investigation, wasn't there? President Cleveland looked into it?
Yes. President Grover Cleveland ordered an investigation led by James Blount. The Blount report concluded that the U.S. minister to Hawaii and the U.S. troops had acted improperly and illegally. Cleveland actually recommended restoring the Queen.
But that didn't happen?
No. The provisional government, set up by the Committee of Safety, flatly refused.
Yeah.
They dug in their heels, declared themselves the Republic of Hawaii, and immediately began pushing aggressively for annexation by the United States.
So they basically ignored the findings and doubled down.
They did. And annexation eventually happened in 1898. But even that process was incredibly fraught with controversy and resistance.
How so?
Well, the new president, McKinley, was much more favorable to annexation and signed a treaty. But the native Hawaiian people mobilized powerful political resistance against it.
This is where the petitions come in.
Exactly. Queen Liliuokalani traveled to Washington, D.C. to lobby against it, and back home, local leaders organized a massive petition drive. These were the coup petitions, the petitions against annexation. They gathered over 21,000 signatures. Just think about that number.
That's huge. How many people was that relative to the population?
It represented more than half the entire native Hawaiian population at the time, an overwhelming statement of opposition.
Wow. So did that stop the treaty?
It did, initially. That massive popular opposition, formally presented, successfully blocked the treaty in the U.S. Senate. A treaty requires a 2/3 majority, and they couldn't get it.
Okay, so if the treaty failed, that legal maneuvering, bypassing the treaty, that seems absolutely key to understanding the heart of the land dispute today, the status of the land itself.
It is the absolute core of the issue. because upon that controversial 1898 annexation, the self-declared Republic of Hawaii transferred approximately 1.8 million acres of land to the U.S. federal government.
1.8 million acres. Where did that land come from?
It was comprised of the former Hawaiian Kingdom government lands and the crown lands that had belonged to the monarchy.
Okay, and these are what we now call the ceded lands.
Legally, yes. They're often referred to as the ceded lands. However, you'll hear many people, particularly Native Hawaiians and advocates, strongly contest that term because the transfer followed what they view as an illegal overthrow and occurred without the democratic consent of, or any compensation to, the indigenous population whose national lands these were. So many people today insist on calling them seized lands or Hawaiian national lands. The crucial point they emphasize is that the Kanaka Maoli, the Native Hawaiian people, never directly relinquished their claims to these national assets.
The argument being you can't legally cede something that was taken improperly in the first place.
That's the essence of it. And this historical injustice, this fundamental disagreement over the legitimacy of the transfer wasn't just ignored forever. It was actually formally acknowledged by the U.S. government itself much later.
You're talking about the Apology Resolution.
Exactly. In 1993, on the 100th anniversary of the overthrow, the U.S. Congress passed Public Law 103-150, commonly known as the Apology Resolution.
And what did it say?
It officially apologized to Native Hawaiians on behalf of the people of the United States for the nation's role in the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii. Crucially, it explicitly acknowledged that the overthrow led to the suppression of the inherent sovereignty of the Native Hawaiian people, and that the transfer of those 1.8 million acres of national lands occurred without the consent of or any compensation to the Native Hawaiian people.
That's a massive admission in federal law, an official apology and acknowledgement of the lack of consent.
It is a landmark statement, although it also included language saying it wasn't intended to serve as a settlement of claims. But the acknowledgement itself is powerful.
Okay, so how does this history of disputed land transfer connect directly to the military bases we see today?
It's intimately linked, because the military currently controls a colossal amount of acreage across the archipelago. Estimates are over 200,000 acres. Maybe closer to 230,000 acres now.
A huge footprint.
A massive footprint. And that land was drawn largely, if not almost entirely, from those very same disputed ceded lands that the U.S. took control of after annexation.
So the bases are physically situated on this historically contested land?
For the most part, yes. Now, when Hawaii eventually became a state in 1959, the U.S. federal government did transfer the title to the majority of the remaining ceded lands, about 1.4 million acres that hadn't already been set aside for federal purposes, like military bases or national parks, back to the newly formed state of Hawaii.
Okay, so the state got control of most of it.
It got title, but with a very significant string attached. The lands were not given free and clear. They were transferred to the state expressly to be held in a public trust.
A public trust, what does that mean legally?
It means the state doesn't own the land like a private owner. It acts as a trustee with a legal fiduciary duty to manage the land and any income generated from it for specific public purposes, benefiting all the people of Hawaii.
This created a massive binding legal obligation then. The Public Land Trust, or PLT.
Precisely. Section 5 of the Hawaii Admission Act, the federal law that made Hawaii a state, established the state as the trustee. This is a legal covenant that shapes state politics and legal battles to this very day.
And what are those specific purposes the state has to manage the land for?
Section 5 lists 5 purposes. They include supporting public schools, making public improvements, the development of farm and home ownership.
Standard public good stuff.
Right. But critically, one of the 5 mandates is specifically for the betterment of the conditions of Native Hawaiians, using the legal definition established in the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act of 1920.
So there's an explicit requirement to use these lands, these former kingdom lands, to benefit Native Hawaiians.
Yes. A specific trust duty owed to the indigenous population embedded in the very act of statehood.
Okay, so how is that benefit supposed to be delivered? How does it work in practice?
Well, to specifically implement that trust provision relating to Native Hawaiians, a new state agency was created back in 1978 through a state constitutional amendment. This is the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, or OHA.
OHA, I've heard of it.
OHA was given the mandate to manage funds and programs for the benefit of Native Hawaiians. And crucially, the state constitution directed that OHA should receive a pro rata portion a fair share of the revenue generated by the state from the use of those ceded lands held in the public land trust.
A pro rata share. What percentage did they decide on?
The state legislature later set that pro rata share at 20%. So in theory, 20% of the income the state makes from leasing or using these trust lands is supposed to go to OHA to fund programs for Native Hawaiians.
In theory. That sounds like there's a catch.
Oh, there's been a huge catch. The financial disputes over what constitutes revenue and how much is actually owed have been running literally for decades. It's been a constant battle.
What's the disagreement about?
The state and O'Kane have disagreed fiercely over the definition of revenue. Does it include just cash receipts? What about non-cash benefits the state receives? How do you value land swaps or certain kinds of permits? This led to years of inconsistent or even non-existent payments, extensive litigation. There was a major Hawaii Supreme Court case in 2001, OHE State, which affirmed the legislature's obligation to actually quantify and pay OHI's share.
So the court confirmed the state had to pay. Did they set an amount?
Not directly. It took until 2006 for the legislature to pass Act 178, which established an interim annual payment of $15.1 million to OSHA.
$15 million a year. Is that considered the correct amount?
Well, that's the ongoing controversy. OSHA and others argue that $15.1 million is far too low and doesn't reflect the true revenue generated from the ceded lands. Based on independent analysis, looking at potentially underreported receipts from things like airport landing fees, harbor fees, commercial leases, and importantly, those military leases.
Ah, the military land use comes back into it.
Right. Proposed legislation filed in 2018 and 2019 suggested that OSHA's actual 20% pro rata share should be closer to $35 million annually, maybe even more, not the $15.1 million interim figure.
So potentially more than double what they've been getting?
Potentially, yes. The core controversy over the public land trust revenue is absolutely ongoing. The state manages these lands, they generate income, but there's a persistent argument that the state systematically undervalues the use of these lands, especially when it comes to military leases or certain commercial deals.
And this underreporting directly impacts the funding meant for Native Hawaiian beneficiaries under the terms of statehood.
Exactly. It ensures that the financial aspects of this historic land seizure and the trust obligations remain actively unresolved and a major source of political and legal conflict.
And you mentioned legal challenges against the military's use of this land specifically.
Yes, because the state has leased vast tracts of these ceded lands to the military, often for minimal cost. Communities in Oahu have challenged this. There was a significant Hawaii Supreme Court ruling in 2019 Ching v. case. This case affirmed that the state, as trustee, has an affirmative duty to actively malama to care for and protect ceded lands.
Even land leased out to others.
Yes, even lands leased to third parties, explicitly including the U.S. military. This particular case involved the lease for the huge Pushikuloa training area on Hawaii Island, about 23,000 acres of state-managed ceded land within the larger 133,000-acre federal training area.
So the court is saying the state can't just lease the land and wash its hands of it. It still has a duty to protect it.
Precisely. The ruling highlighted the state's difficult dual role. It acts as an essential partner to the U.S. military for national defense, but it's simultaneously the legal trustee charged with protecting these indigenous national lands for its beneficiaries. It's a fundamental conflict embedded in the system.
Okay, that historical and legal framework, the disputed land, the trust obligations, it brings us right into the present-day reality, the immediate impact of having this massive military machine embedded within the community. And it seems like an incredibly complex duality, doesn't it? On one hand, the military is seen as essential for regional security, maybe even national security.
And a huge economic driver, you can't deny that.
Right, a massive economic engine. But on the other hand, its very presence seems to distort life, create friction, and impose costs on everyone living there, especially Native Hawaiians.
That's the tension, exactly. We heard that story about Marcus, the cafe owner, operating right outside a major army base.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Well, Marcus's experience really shines a light on that strange mix of economic reliance and structural distortion. His small business basically thrives or fails entirely based on the deployment cycles and the pay schedules of the local garrison.
So his income is completely tied to the military rhythm.
Completely. And he sees both sides. The military is undeniably a huge economic engine. The Department of Defense, just in fiscal year 2023, spent nearly $10 billion in Hawaii.
$10 billion? That's enormous.
It is. It supports huge federal payrolls, big construction contracts, countless service jobs like Marcus's Cafe.
But Marcus also pointed out that the economy isn't just robust, it feels dependent.
Right, dependent is the word he used. And he observes how that dependence dictates the entire operational tempo, not just for businesses like his, but for the whole community. It creates this immense friction.
And the benefits of that $10 billion, they're not evenly spread, are they?
Not at all. It tends to concentrate wealth in certain sectors and actively hollows out the middle class that isn't directly connected to federal jobs or federal housing support. It creates stark inequalities.
That economic distortion, where is it most profoundly visible? Where does it hit people hardest?
Without a doubt, it's the housing market. This is the primary mechanism where abstract strategic security policy directly translates into devastating local costs, particularly for non-military residents.
How does that work? What's the driver?
The main driver is the Basic Allowance for Housing, or BAH.
BAH. Okay, explain how BAH works, because this seems to be where the cycle really kicks in.
Right. So BAH is a non-taxable housing allowance that military personnel receive on top of their regular base pay. It's specifically designed to cover housing costs in the civilian market where they're stationed. And it's calculated based on two main factors. The service members' higher ranks get more, and critically, their geographical location. It's pegged directly to the local housing costs in that specific zip code or military housing area.
So it's just for how expensive the area is?
Exactly. And Hawaii, especially Oahu, is notoriously expensive. So, for example, we saw figures indicating that in 2024, the BAH for a fairly junior enlisted soldier, say an E5 with dependents, living in the high-cost Honolulu area was well over $3,000 per month, tax-free.
Over $3,000 a month just for housing, tax-free.
Correct. This allowance essentially guarantees that military family a significant federally backed housing budget that adjusts upwards as local costs rise.
Okay, I think I see where this is going. This creates a vicious cycle, doesn't it? An inflationary spiral.
That's precisely what happens. As housing prices and rents rise in Hawaii, and they are consistently among the very highest in the entire nation, the Department of Defense adjusts the BAH upward. They have to ensure military families can still afford to live off base in the local market.
So the allowance chases the rising market.
It chases it, and it enables it. This allows military households, who are effectively shielded by this massive inflation-proof federal housing support, to consistently outbid local residents for the limited available housing stock, especially rental properties.
They can afford the higher rents because their allowance goes up to match.
Right. Landlords know this, naturally. So that increased demand, coupled with the guaranteed purchasing power provided by BAH, drives rents up even further for everyone.
Which then triggers another BAH adjustment upward in the next cycle.
And round it goes.
Yeah.
Now compare that junior enlisted soldier's $3,000 plus tax-free housing budget to, say, a local teacher, or a hotel worker, or someone working in retail or agriculture earning local wages.
They don't get an automatic inflation-proof housing stipend from their employer.
Not even close. So the competition for decent housing becomes essentially impossible for many local families. They simply can't compete with the federally subsidized buying power flowing into the market.
And the consequence is displacement.
Stark displacement. The people who are most severely affected are those earning below the median income, those working in the service industry or non-federal jobs, who lack that crucial federal housing support. This militarized economy, fueled by BAH, contributes directly and significantly to severe housing shortages and unaffordability, which in turn results in heartbreakingly high rates of houselessness.
Particularly among Native Hawaiians.
Disproportionately among Native Hawaiians, yes. It's the cruelest irony. Their ancestral homeland, already shrunk by historical land seizures for plantations and military bases, now they're being pushed out of the remaining communities, sometimes onto the streets, or forced to move to the mainland simply by overwhelming economic force.
Do you have numbers on that?
Estimates consistently show that Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders make up a hugely disproportionate percentage of the houseless population in Hawaii. Some figures suggest it could be as high as 40 or 42%, while they represent a much smaller fraction of the overall state population.
42%. That's staggering. It really is history repeating itself, isn't it? First physical eviction, now economic eviction.
It feels that way to many people, yes. A continuous cycle of displacement driven by external forces, whether it's sugar barons, the military directly, or now the economic distortions caused by the military presence.
And this economic loss isn't just limited to the insane housing costs, is it? It also relates back to the land itself, the sheer amount of valuable land the military controls, and how cheaply they seem to acquire its use from the state.
Absolutely. We need to talk about those land use conflicts and the concept of foregone revenue.
You mentioned nominal leases earlier.
Yes. Historically, and even continuing in some cases, the state of Hawaii, despite its trustee duty, has felt compelled or perhaps politically pressured to lease massive tracts of its ceded lands, those public land trust lands, to the military for incredibly low rates.
How low are we talking?
Sometimes, literally $1 per year for a lease covering thousands of acres, often for terms stretching 65 years or even longer.
$1 for 65 years for prime land in Hawaii.
It sounds unbelievable, but these deals exist or have existed. This is obviously not market value. It represents a systemic policy failure or perhaps a deliberate choice, where the state, acting as the supposed trustee for the people and for Native Hawaiians, essentially forfeits massive potential financial assets to the federal government.
That lost potential income, that's the opportunity cost, right?
Staggering opportunity costs. Let's try to put some rough numbers on it just to get a sense of scale. Independent estimates have been done. If you take, say, just 6,000 acres of state-controlled ceded land currently used by the military on Oahu, maybe areas like Kahuku Training Area or parts of Makua Valley, and lease them at a very conservative rural or agricultural market rate, let's say $30,000 per acre per year, which might even be low for Oahu.
Okay, 6,000 acres times $30,000.
That represents an annual foregone revenue of $180 million, just from those 6,000 acres.
$180 million every year lost to the state coffers.
Lost to the state general fund, yes. And importantly, remember that 20% pro rata share for OSHA, if that revenue were actually collected.
OSHA should be getting 20% of that $180 million.
Based on those high-end estimates we talked about earlier, that would be around $36 million annually, just from that one hypothetical parcel that should have gone directly to OSHA for Native Hawaiian benefit programs. Instead, because of the $1 leases, they get effectively zero from it.
So the true cost of militarization is systematically hidden, in a way, because these proper market rate land appraisals and lease payments for massive military holdings often just don't happen or aren't made public.
That's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
The lack of transparency around the true market value of these lands and the terms of the leases makes it hard to quantify the full extent of the loss. But it undoubtedly impacts the state's ability to fund basic public services like education, healthcare, and infrastructure for everyone.
And this financial loss is compounded by ongoing environmental and cultural concerns about how the military actually uses that land, isn't it?
Absolutely. Take the Pukalawa Training Area, PTA, on Hawaii Island. It's the largest military training ground in Hawaii, covering 133,000 acres between Mauna Loa and Mauna Kea, much of it leased from the state for those nominal rates.
And there are concerns there.
Major concerns. There's documented environmental contamination, including the presence of unexploded ordnance, or UXO, from decades of live fire training. There are also serious community fears about potential depleted uranium contamination from spotting rounds used in the past. Cultural sites are also impacted, and the state's obligation, remember, affirmed in that Ching v. Case ruling, is to actively malama, to protect that land, even while it's being used for heavy military training. It creates this constant tension.
A tension between military readiness and the state's trust duty.
Exactly. But perhaps nothing illustrates the catastrophic environmental risk associated with the military presence better and links right back to that frontline vulnerability we discussed than the devastating 2021 fuel leak at the Red Hill Bulk Fuel Storage Facility on Oahu.
Red Hill, that was a huge story. Tell us about that facility.
Red Hill is, or was, an incredible piece of engineering from World War II. 20 massive underground storage tanks, literally carved into the volcanic rock, each capable of holding 12.5 million gallons of fuel.
20 tanks. That's 250 million gallons of jet fuel and marine diesel.
250 million gallons. And here's the terrifying part. These aging tanks were positioned precariously, just 100 feet above Oahu's primary drinking water source, the southern Oahu Basal Aquifer.
The main water supply for Honolulu.
The sole source aquifer, providing drinking water for about 400,000 people, including military families and base housing and the wider Honolulu area.
And it leaked.
Catastrophically.
Yep.
In November 2021, one of the tanks leaked thousands of gallons of jet fuel directly into the Navy's water distribution system connected to the aquifer. It poisoned the drinking water of thousands of military families and local residents. People got sick rashes, headaches, neurological issues. It fulfilled the dire warnings that environmental groups and Native Hawaiian advocates have been sounding for years, decades even, about the inherent risks of that facility.
It's the ultimate nightmare scenario, isn't it? Prioritizing military logistics, having massive fuel reserves ready right above the population's essential, irreplaceable drinking water.
It is the most terrifying, real-world illustration of how prioritizing military necessity can lead directly to the poisoning of life-sustaining infrastructure for an entire island. It shows the tangible consequence of living inside the policy, where perceived military needs can supersede basic environmental safety and public health.
Okay, beyond the economic distortions and the environmental disasters, there's also a tremendous cultural and social displacement cost.
Immense, and often harder to quantify but deeply felt. We have that powerful story of Leilani and Elder Kapuna.
What did she describe?
She talked about seeing the sacred places of her youth, places where her grandmother taught her the traditional names of the winds and the rains, now completely dominated by gray warships in the harbor or fenced off entirely behind military baselines.
A loss of connection to place.
A profound loss. And her quiet grief was just palpable. She spake about her own grandchildren, unable to afford housing on their ancestral island because of those economic sources we described, being forced to move to the U.S. mainland just to survive.
That breaks the generational ties.
It creates this deep sense of cultural erasure, of becoming a stranger in your own homeland. This isn't just nostalgia, it's the lived experience of ongoing displacement. And it's part of a much longer 20th century legacy. Think about the construction of the Pearl Harbor base itself. That project destroyed at least 36 traditional Hawaiian fish ponds, intricate, sustainable aquaculture systems that fed communities for generations.
Turned a food source into a naval stronghold.
Exactly. And countless other sacred sites across the islands have been fenced off, damaged by training, or simply restricted from access for cultural practices. Places like Kahoola'a, Makua Valley.
Makua Valley on Oahu's Waianae coast. That's another really poignant example, isn't it?
It is, a clear and heartbreaking one. Native Hawaiian families who had lived and farmed there for generations were forcibly evicted by the military in the 1940s, during World War II.
With the promise they could return.
With the explicit promise that they could return to their homes and farms after the war ended. But that promise was broken. Instead, the valley was converted into a major live-fire training range. It was bombed and shelled for decades. Today, it remains largely contaminated with unexploded ordnance, and access is heavily restricted, even for cultural practitioners.
So the military presence renders ancestral lands not just inaccessible, but often economically unproductive and environmentally hazardous, actively violating those past promises.
Is often the reality. And this hidden social cost, this normalization of danger, it filters right down into daily life in some communities.
How so?
We've seen evidence, reports from communities near bases or training areas. Children living in residential areas adjacent to installations sometimes receive routine safety instruction at school about what to do if they find unexploded ordnance. UXO becomes part of their curriculum.
Learning about bombs is part of daily safety.
Right. Families living near training areas report finding artillery shells, bullet casings, or other munitions fragments on their properties after exercises. It's just there.
That seems like the ultimate hidden social price of constant militarization, doesn't it? Where exposure to military debris and potential danger becomes just an accepted, almost normalized part of the background radiation of life.
It is, especially when you consider that the burden of this normalization, living closest to the fence lines, living with the noise, the dust, the risk, it disproportionately falls on Native Hawaiian and lower-income communities located closest to these military lands. It's the cost of security, but the bill isn't shared equally. #tag outro.
So if we try to synthesize everything we've just unpacked,
Yeah.
strategy, history, economics, environment, culture, the core contradiction defining modern Hawaii becomes almost impossible to ignore, doesn't it?
He really does stare you in the face.
On one hand, the islands are absolutely indispensable to U.S. power projection, securing trade routes, managing alliances, deterring aggression across the vast Pacific Ocean. That strategic imperative is clearly paramount to U.S. global influence and its vision of regional stability.
Undeniably crucial from that geopolitical perspective.
But This immense strategic importance, this fortress, is built quite literally on a foundation of profound historical injustice, the illegal overthrow, the annexation against the people's will, the seizure of national lands, and it requires continuous, ongoing social, economic, and environmental sacrifice that is borne disproportionately by the Native Hawaiian community and other local residents.
Yeah, absolutely. You've hit the core conflict precisely. The strategic security of the Pacific, as defined by the U.S., is intrinsically, inescapably tied to the internal struggles of these islands. That history of occupation isn't just history. It lives on in the ongoing land disputes, in the fight over ceded land revenues, in the very presence of the bases on contested ground. And the resulting economic stress, the housing crisis fueled by BAH, the environmental damage like Red Hill. It all demonstrates that the true cost of being a fortress isn't just measured in the billions of dollars spent on defense.
It's paid elsewhere.
It's paid daily by the people who live there, paid in cultural erosion as families are forced out, paid in the poisoning of precious life-giving resources like water, and paid in that constant underlying psychological weight of living perpetually, quite literally, on the front line of global tensions. That's the enduring reality beneath the postcard.